Alright, it's been 6 months since we've been growing the Anubias plants in my Emersed setup, and I am super excited because today we finally get to take the plants out and really get to see how much growth we got. As a recap, this is an ebb and flow system, which means the water level rises and falls in each one of these tubs, and it bathes the plants in water and nutrients. And the idea behind that is it's going to promote the plant growth. And so in this experiment, we were evaluating the differences between regular gravel as a substrate and a mixture of gravel and soil as a substrate, and we want to see which substrate grew the plants the best. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at these plants and see exactly how much growth we got. Alright, so here's a close-up of one of the bins that we're growing the Anubias plants in, and across the board all the plants look really healthy, which is great to see. There's no immediate differences that you can see whether the plant was grown in the gravel substrate versus the soil and gravel, and that does make sense to me because I am fertilizing the water column. So if one of the substrates is lacking in a specific nutrient, it is very likely that the plant can get that nutrient from the fertilizer that's floating around in the water column. However, I am curious to see the root structure of these plants to see if there's any differences between the soil-grown Anubias plants versus the gravel. So let's take a closer look. Alright, so we have all the Anubias plants laid out. The gravel treatment is on this side of the table and the soil and gravel is on this side of the table. And like I said, I'm really impressed with the growth, and I can't tell too many differences between the gravel and the soil and gravel. So what that's telling me is that substrate might not be as important of a factor, and that our Emersed setup with the ebb and flow functionality is actually quite a good way of growing these plants. Alright, so one of the things I did notice when growing these plants is that algae started to form on the leaves, and it even got so severe that I would take out some of the containers periodically and hose them down lightly with a hose or spray them with a spray bottle to kind of dislodge that algae. A few things that I found helped controlling the algae was adding snails. They did a really good job eating the algae off of the leaves. And then also leading up to actually filming this video, I wanted to see if I could remove the algae from the leaves altogether. So what I did was I removed the bell siphon from the system, and so that caused the water level to rise and basically overflow into the standpipe and stay at the maximum depth level for each system. And so what that did was that allowed the snails free range on all of the leaves, and for a period of a few weeks I was actually growing all of these plants completely submersed. And so by doing that, we kind of learned two things. One, the transition from the ebb and flow system to a fully submerged system did not result in any dieback. That being said, Anubias is a pretty hardy plant and doesn't tend to die back regardless when you go from a full immersed setup to an aquarium. But nevertheless, the leaves and everything look really healthy and there was no sign of dieback. And the second thing that we learned is that the snails did a really great job. Once they had free range on the leaves and they weren't limited to the ebb and flow cycle to actually eat the algae from the leaves, they cleaned up most of the algae, so much so that there's only really a few leaves in this bunch that have some algae deposits on them. Everything else looks pretty happy. Alright, so let's pull up some of these plants and we'll take a closer look at what the root structure looks like. Alright, so as I'm pulling up some of these Anubias plants that were grown in the gravel treatment, I'm seeing some really healthy roots here, and you can tell that because the roots are really white and there's no sign of, decaying roots. Typically, when plants are grown in a stressful environment, whether that's in some sort of anoxic condition in the root layer, you'll see some really dark or even black roots. That's typically a sign that the roots aren't as healthy. Also, any kind of fungus or weird growth that's growing on the roots is also not a good sign. And so I'm not seeing any of these in the gravel grown roots, so that's really good. Also, some of the roots are even green on the bottoms, and so what I figure is happening there is the roots are actually growing through the container, and then they're actually getting light from the shelf that's below them, and that's actually causing the roots to develop that green pigmentation. So that's also kind of interesting to notice. As I'm harvesting these Anubias plants, I should let you guys know some future plans that we have with this Anubias. I've actually upgraded some of the lighting and some of the other things to do with my Emersed setup, and I plan on doing a new experiment using Anubias plants as well as crypt plants. and I'm going to be trying to quantify their growth a little bit better. This experiment was obviously more qualitative than anything. We're not really measuring, the biomass or anything really specific with these plants. It's just kind of evaluating the differences visually on how the plants grew. And based on what we're seeing here, I don't think there's any kind of significant difference between the two. But hopefully in this upcoming experiment, I'm hoping to actually kind of put a little bit more effort into quantifying the growth of these plants, being able to evaluate the differences on a few different environmental variables. All right, so all of the gravel plants are now harvested, and I have them all in this container here. The nice thing with not having soil in these containers is that all the roots are really clean, and there's really not much else needing to be done with these plants. As you can see here, we do have some pretty mature Anubias plants that we could then go on to propagate if we want to. We can add this to our aquariums if we have a new aquascape coming up. So really versatile and a great way to be growing plants. I have a prediction that the soil plant's going to be a little bit more messy, so I might have to run those under the tap to clean off some of the attached soil. Alright, so shortly after starting this experiment, I did start to see some signs of deficiencies in my plants, specifically around iron. I thought maybe the water column fertilizer that I was using was deficient, but after looking into it a little bit more, it seemed to me that the pH of my water was actually causing iron to be not available to the plants. And this is something that's well known in the hydroponics, that there's certain nutrients that, depending on the pH of your water, they might be more or less bioavailable for your plants. So in my case, I have pretty hard water that is high in pH, and that is probably the worst pH you could have specifically for iron. And I'll show up a chart right now where you can see that iron's not really that bioavailable at higher pHs. And so what I think was happening was, because of that high pH, I had iron in the solution for my plants. So iron was present, but it wasn't actually being able to be used by the plants. And so that resulted in deficiency. So that was kind of interesting to see. And after realizing this, I bought some pH buffer, which is basically like phosphoric acid that's commonly used in hydroponic setups. And so once I buffered that pH and brought it down from where it was to where it's most available for the plants, within a matter of days and then even the following weeks, the new growth that was coming off of the plants that were initially showing signs of iron deficiency was perfectly healthy, did not show any signs of deficiency. So it was really interesting to be able to make that change and see the plants respond to that in a really short period of time. So what that shows me is that the pH of our system is actually really important, and you can have a lot of nutrients present in the water, but if you don't have the right pH, it's not all going to be usable by your plants, and you still might get some deficiencies anyways. So if you're troubleshooting a deficiency problem, you might want to look at what your pH is and consider if there's a possibility that your pH is causing the nutrients to be locked out and not available to your plants. Alright, so I'm almost done picking through the soil and gravel treatments, and just taking a look at the roots here, I'm actually seeing some pretty healthy roots as well. I thought maybe with the soil it would cause a little bit more of an anoxic environment, and we would see some of those signs of stress in the plants that I was talking about earlier, but really I'm not seeing any of that. Obviously with some of the soil, the roots are a little bit discolored, but I think that's just the soil and not actually a reflection of their health. And similarly, the really long roots that probably extended underneath the containers are actually green, so there is some sort of chlorophyll that's being formed on the roots when they're exposed to light, which is really interesting to see as well. But altogether, both of these treatments, the plants look really healthy. This leaves me feeling very optimistic that this ebb and flow system is really a good way of growing plants, and I'm excited to start experimenting with some other types of plants, not just Anubias plants. I would love to get some Bucephalandra growing. It's a very similar plant to Anubias, so I think that would respond really well in these setups. And also all kinds of stem plants and crypts I think would do really well in this as well. Okay, so all of the Anubias has been harvested and they're in these 2 containers here. There's probably around 50 in each container, and that's before propagating any of these plants. A lot of these Anubias is really quite mature and can be propagated into 2 or 3 different plants. So that probably brings the total to a couple hundred individual plants if we wanted to go ahead and propagate them and replant them in our Emersed setup. Now when we started this experiment, we did the gravel versus the soil and gravel, but we also set up a traditional Emersed setup so that we can evaluate what is the difference from the ebb and flow system to a regular Emersed bin where we have a soil substrate and we just grow the plants strictly in an Emersed environment. So I have that control container down here, and let's open it up and see how much growth was in the Emersed tub versus what we got out of our ebb and flow system. Alright, so right off the bat, these plants are also looking pretty healthy. I have no complaints there. There is some algae and some moss that's growing on the soil that's kind of extended up on some of the smaller plants, so that's covering some of the leaves, and it doesn't look the best, but I think that could be washed off if we were to, run these under the tap. I am curious to pull some of these out, take a look at their roots, and see if the roots are looking pretty healthy. I will say right off the bat, I don't think these plants grew as vigorously as some of the other ones. And as expected, some of these roots are a little bit discolored, which could be a sign of a lack of oxygen in the root layer, which makes sense because this is pretty compact soil, and it's also highly saturated with water, so there's not going to be a lot of pore space here for oxygen to get to the plant's roots. And as a result, I think that did kind of hinder some of the growth that these plants experienced. And also, interestingly, what I'm seeing here is some of these plants seem a little bit more compact growth, which could be a nice thing if you wanted a compact looking plant. However, I do think that's probably caused by the plant being stunted to some degree, whether that's a lack of nutrients or maybe not as much oxygen in the root layer. These plants definitely are not growing as fast as the ebb and flow system. So I think that's something to keep in mind, especially if you want to grow plants for profit or at least to kind of expand the amount of plants that you have for future aquascapes. So if that's something that you're interested in, you might want to consider some other types of Emersed setups that might grow plants a little bit faster for you. On the flip side though, this type of setup is super easy and cheap to put together. So the fact that it's still growing some pretty healthy plants is a really good option if you just want to grow plants on a budget, or you have some extra soil and tubs laying around that you want to experiment with growing some Emersed plants. It definitely works, and I think it can be enhanced by spraying your plants with fertilizer. I've had some really great success doing that in the past as well. So that's obviously an avenue you can go if you just want to get started with growing some Emersed plants. Overall, I would say this experiment is a success. We got a ton of Anubias out of it, and I think the ebb and flow Emersed setup has some real potential that I'm excited to keep growing plants in. I hope you enjoyed the video. Feel free to subscribe if you want to see some more experiments coming down the road. Until next time, I'll see you later.